Everybody in Coldwater Bend knew what old Amos Kettle was worth. Cattle, water rights, the good bottomland by the river, a house with real glass windows. So when they read his will out loud in the front room of the bank, the whole town leaned in like buzzards on a fence rail. And when they got to the boy, to Eli, the lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his little round spectacles, and said the old man had left him $20. A single folded bill in a dented tobacco tin. $20, after 10 years of breaking his back on that ranch for free. The room laughed. Not all at once, it started with a snort from the back, then spread, the way a grass fire spreads, until even the lawyer had to hide his mouth behind his hand. Eli stood there in the middle of it with his hat crushed in his fists and his ears going red, and he didn't say a word. Here's the thing about that $20, though. I watched the whole business from the doorway, and I've had a lot of years since to turn it over. That bill wasn't an insult. It was a door. And what was on the other side of it would end up mattering more to that boy than every acre Amos Kettle ever owned. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell it the way it happened. The laughing is the part I remember first, and I'm not proud that I remember it that way, but there it is. My name's Silas Vane. I ranched the dry quarter east of the bend, the piece nobody wanted because the wind comes across it like it's got somewhere to be. I've kept a weather book going on 30 years now. Every morning first thing before coffee even, I write down the sky. Color, cloud, the smell of it. My late wife used to say a man who writes down the weather is a man trying to hold on to something that won't be held. She wasn't wrong. But it's a habit, and habits are what's left when the people are gone. I mention the book because the morning of Amos Kettle's will reading, I'd written, sky the color of an old bruise, wind out of the north. Smells like nothing at all, which is worse than rain. I should have paid closer attention to my own hand. The reading was at the bank because Amos had no family left to host it, only the boy, and the boy didn't count as family to most folks. Eli had come to the Kettle place 10 years back as a half-starved kid of 12, after the fever took both his mother and father in one bad winter. Amos took him in. Nobody knew exactly why. Amos wasn't a soft man. He was the kind of old that had gone hard all the way through, like a fence post left too long in the sun. He worked Eli like a hired hand and paid him like a stray dog, which is to say, in scraps and a place to sleep. And if there was any love in it, Amos kept it hid so well that most of us figured there wasn't any at all. So there was Eli, 22 years old, standing in the bank in his one clean shirt, when they told him what a decade came to. $20. The rest, all of it, went to a nephew nobody in the Bend had ever laid eyes on, a man named Crandall Kettle down in the city who Amos hadn't spoken to in 30 years. The lawyer read the nephew's name like it tasted bad, but the law's the law. Crandall got the ranch. Crandall got the cattle. Crandall got the water. And Eli got a tobacco tin. The lawyer held it out. It was a little thing, dented on one corner, the paint worn off so you couldn't read what brand it had once been. Eli didn't take it right away. He looked at it in the lawyer's soft pink hand, and something moved across his face that I've spent years trying to name. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the look of a man doing sums in his head and coming up short every single time. Then the laughing started. I want to tell you I said something. I didn't. I stood in the doorway with my hat in my hands like the coward I can be when it's easiest, and I let those people laugh at that boy. Ricker from the feed store laughing, the Pettibone sisters laughing behind their gloves, the banker himself, a smile pushing up under his mustache. I watched Eli take the tin, finally, and close his fist around it, and walk out through the middle of all that noise with his back so straight it looked like it hurt him. He didn't run, I'll give him that, he walked. I caught up to him at the hitching rail, where his horse, an ugly, loyal, sway-backed gelding named Duff, was tied. The wind had picked up. My weather book had it right. There was no smell to the air at all, just that dry northern push that scours a man's thoughts flat. Eli, I said. He didn't turn around. He was working the reins loose with fingers that weren't cooperating. Eli, that was a low thing they done, all of them. You were in there too, Mr. Vane. He said it quiet, not accusing, just true, which was worse. I felt that one land. I said, and I'm sorry for it, I should have spoke. He got the reins loose and stood there holding them, still not looking at me, and the tin was in his other hand. I could see now that his knuckles were split and healing, winter work, mending fence in the cold, the kind of work that pays you in blood and nothing else. He'd done that work on a ranch that was never going to be his and now never would be. He could have left me nothing, Eli said at last. Nothing would have been honest, nothing I'd have understood, but $20, his voice caught, and he clamped down on it hard. $20 is a man reaching up out of his grave to point at you and grin. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there is one. He swung up onto Duff. From up there he finally looked down at me, and I saw his eyes were wet and furious at being wet. You want to know the joke of it, he said. I loved him, the old bastard. 10 years, and I never once heard him say a kind word, and I loved him anyway, because he took me in when the fever left me with nobody. And this is what he thought I was worth. Then he rode off north, toward the Kettle place he'd have to clear out of by month's end, and I stood there in the wind feeling every one of my 60 years. Now here's where I have to tell you what I didn't know at the time, because Eli told me the rest of it later in pieces, over a lot of coffee and a couple of hard winters. I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to me, straight through, because that's the only way it makes sense. He didn't open the tin that first night. He told me he set it on the windowsill of the little lean-to room off the barn where he'd slept for 10 years, and he looked at it, and he hated it. He was that close to throwing it in the stove. He said the fire was going, and he had it in his hand, and he could feel the heat of the door on his knuckles. Stubbornness saved him, not sense stubbornness. He told me he thought, no, I'm not going to give the old man the satisfaction of burning it. I'll spend the $20 on whiskey and I'll spit on his grave, and that'll be that. So he opened it to get the money out. The bill was there, folded in quarters, an old note, older than the ones the bank was handing out, a 20 from years back, soft as cloth from handling. But it wasn't a loan. Under it, folded even smaller, was a scrap of paper. Amos's handwriting, which Eli knew from 1,000 feed orders and tally sheets. Cramped, hard, all straight lines, a man's hand that had never once written anything gentle. It said, "Boy, count it careful, twice." That was all. Eli told me he sat down on the edge of the cot and read those 4 words maybe 40 times. Count it careful, twice. Count what? There was one bill, 120. You don't need to count to 1. He nearly missed it. He told me he had the tin turned upside down in his lap, shaking it, thinking maybe there were coins stuck in the corner, and that's when his thumb caught the false bottom. The tin was deeper on the outside than the inside. Amos had soldered a little shelf of tin down inside it, painted it to match, so it looked like the floor of the box. And when Eli got a knife point under it and pried, it came up. Underneath was another bill. And under that one, another. I've thought a lot about what that must have been like, sitting alone in a cold lean-to. Everyone in town laughing at you not 2 hours before, prying up the bottom of a tin box, and finding it wasn't the bottom at all. He counted them out on the cot. Old bills, all of them soft and folded, some of them older than Eli was. He counted them careful. Then, because a dead man had told him to, he counted them twice. It came to $460. For a ranch hand who'd worked 10 years for board and scraps, $460 was a fortune, near 2 years' wages for a paid man, and Eli had never been a paid man. He said his hands were shaking so bad he had to stop and press them flat on his knees. He said he laughed once, this ugly bark of a laugh, and then he was crying, and he couldn't have told you which one he was doing more of. But it wasn't the money, not really. He figured that out slower. Because there was one more thing in the bottom of that tin, folded up tighter than all the rest, so small and stiff it took him a minute to work it open without tearing. It wasn't money. It was a piece of a letter, the bottom half torn, so it started in the middle of a sentence. And it was in a different hand, not Amos's hard straight lines. Eli knew this hand too. He'd only ever seen it a few times, on the flyleaf of a Bible and on the back of one old photograph. But a boy remembers his father's writing the way he remembers his voice. The torn scrap said, "And I know I got no right to ask it of you, Amos, after everything between us, but he's a good boy, better than me. If it ever comes to it, look after him. I'll owe you past the grave. T. T for Thomas, Eli's father." Eli told me he didn't sleep that night, and I believe him. He lay on that cot with $460 and half a torn letter on his chest, and he tried to make the pieces fit, and they wouldn't, not yet. He'd never known his father and Amos Kettle had so much as met. Thomas had been a drifter, a horse breaker, gone more than home, dead of fever when Eli was 12. Amos was a fixture, rooted to that bottomland by the river his whole life. What was everything between us? What did Amos owe a dead drifter, or the dead drifter owe him? And why had a hard old man, who never said one soft word, spend 10 years pretending Eli was worth nothing? And then, from the grave, hand him a fortune with instructions to count it careful. He got up before dawn. He told me the sky was going gray at the edges, and he stood in the doorway of the barn looking at it. And this is the part that gets me. He said the first thing he thought of was my weather book. That folks like me and Amos, we're always trying to hold on to something that won't be held. And he thought maybe the tin was Amos's version of it. A hard man's way of writing down something he couldn't say out loud. That morning Eli did two things. The first was, he saddled Duff and rode into the bend, and he did not buy whiskey, and he did not spit on any graves. He went to the lawyer's office and he asked one question. Where could he find out who'd held the mortgage, years back, on his father's old place, the little failed homestead north of the river where Eli had been born, and where his folks had died, and which the bank had swallowed the winter after? The lawyer, to his credit, stopped being amused. He got down his books. The second thing Eli did he told me about much later and quieter. Before he rode out that morning, he went to the corner of the Kettle place where Amos was buried, fresh dirt still mounded, no stone yet. And he stood there a long while. He didn't spit. He didn't say much. He told me all he finally said was, "You could have just told me, you old fool." And then he went to find out what the tin was really for. The mortgage on Thomas's old homestead had been bought up, the lawyer's book said, near 10 years back. Paid off entire, the debt cleared, the deed set aside. Held in trust. For Eli. The buyer's name was in the ledger in that same cramped, hard, straight-lined hand. A. Kettle. Eli stood in the lawyer's office and read it and read it. Amos had bought the land where Eli was born, the failed, worthless, heartbreak homestead north of the river, the same winter he'd taken the orphan boy in. Paid the bank in full. And then said nothing. For 10 years. Worked the boy like a stray and let the whole town think Eli was a charity case, a mouth to feed, while up in a drawer somewhere sat a deed with the boy's name on it, waiting. The lawyer said the land had been Eli's legally since he came of age. He just hadn't known it existed. Nobody had told him. That was in the instructions too, not to be told until after Amos was gone. Eli asked why. The lawyer didn't know. Lawyers rarely do. They know the what and almost never the why. But Eli figured out the why. It took him the ride home to do it. Here's what he pieced together, and here's what he told me, and I've never had cause to doubt it. Thomas and Amos had known each other young. Before Eli, before the fever, before any of us in the bend had settled in enough to have opinions. They'd worked cattle together up north, two hard young men, and something had gone wrong between them, a woman, a debt, a betrayal. Eli never learned exactly what, and I don't think he wanted to. Everything between us. Whatever it was, it had split them, and they'd carried it for 30 years, and they'd never spoken again. Except once. Thomas, dying of fever, knowing he was dying, with a wife already dead in the next room and a 12-year-old boy who was about to be alone in the world. Thomas had written to the one man he'd sworn he'd never ask anything of again. The one man hard enough to keep a promise past the grave. I know I got no right to ask it of you. But he's a good boy, better than me. And Amos, old, hard, alone, a man who'd nursed 30 years of a grudge like a coal he wouldn't let go out, Amos had gotten that letter. And he'd bought the boy's land. And he'd taken the boy in. And he'd worked him hard and fed him little and never once said a kind word. Eli thought that was cruelty, all those years. It wasn't, or it wasn't only that. It was a hard man who didn't know any other way. Amos couldn't say I loved your father once before it all went wrong. He couldn't say I'm keeping this promise because it's the last thing left of a friendship I ruined. He couldn't say you're safe, boy. You've got land and a little money and a place in the world. I made sure of it. Men like Amos, men like me, if I'm honest, we can't say those things. The words won't come up out of us. They get stuck somewhere south of the throat and they die there. So instead, Amos soldered a false bottom into a tobacco tin. He saved in secret a little at a time for 10 years. You don't build up $460 in soft old bills overnight. Not on a ranch, not ever. And he folded a torn letter in the bottom of it. The boy's father's own words, proof of who Eli was and who'd loved him. And he wrote 4 words a boy would only find if he was stubborn enough not to burn the thing. Count it careful, twice. The mockery in the bank, the $20, the laughing town. Amos couldn't have cared less about that. He was dead. He wasn't leaving Eli a public inheritance. He was leaving him a private one, meant for Eli's eyes only, wrapped inside an insult so nobody would think to look twice. The whole town saw $20 and a joke. Only the boy would ever pry up the bottom. It was the tenderest thing that ever passed between two men who couldn't stand to be tender out loud. I remember the day Eli came back into the bend and told me. It was months after. He'd moved on to his father's old homestead by then, his own land, free and clear, the deed in a box he kept better than Amos had kept his tin. He'd used some of the money to fix the well and buy 2 milk cows and mend the worst of the fence. He'd hung his father's Bible on a shelf and next to it, unfolded and pressed flat under glass. Because he'd taken up that habit too, the holding onto, the torn half of the letter. We sat on his porch. The wind was down for once. I'd brought my book out of habit and I wrote that evening, sky clear, gold at the west edge, smells like turned earth and cattle and something green trying. First time in a long while there'd been a smell to the air at all. Eli told me the whole of it, and when he was done, he was quiet a while, and then he said the thing I've carried ever since. I hated him for 10 years, he said. And the last 10 of those days since I opened that tin, I've been trying to love him instead. And you know what's the worst of it, Mr. Vane? I can't tell him. He's gone. He fixed it so I couldn't hate him and he fixed it so I couldn't thank him neither. He gets the last word. Old bastard gets the last word after all. He laughed when he said it. But his eyes did that furious wet thing again, same as the day at the hitching rail. I told him something then that I don't often say to anybody. I told him I understood the old man perfectly. That there's a kind of man who spends his whole life unable to give love with an open hand, and so he learns to hide it in a deed, in a tin, in a weather book, in whatever won't require him to stand there and say the words while somebody watches him mean them. It's not the best way. It's a coward's way, maybe. But it's not nothing. It's the opposite of nothing. He didn't leave you $20, I said. He left you everything he had and no way to argue with him about it. That's about as much as a man like Amos knew how to love. Eli didn't say anything to that for a long time. Then he got up and went inside and came back out with the tin. Empty now, the false bottom pried up and left up, so you could see the little soldered shelf and the space beneath it. He turned it over in his hands. I keep thinking I ought to fill it back up, he said, for somebody, someday, if it ever comes to it. The same words, his father's words near enough, if it ever comes to it. I didn't point that out, he knew. You could see he knew. The sun was most of the way down. Duff was cropping grass by the mended fence, on land that had been lost and was found again, and the wind stayed down, and neither of us said anything else for a good while. Eli set the tin on the porch rail between us, $20 the town had said, and laughed.